All right. So here in the text, line 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're talking about the authentic hadith in this third line. أولها الصحيح. The first of the types of hadith is the authentic one. وهو ما اتصل إسناده. It's that which its chain connected. ولم يشذ أو يعل. ولم يشذ أو يعل. We are just right here though. ولم يشذ. And it was not irregular. So the situation of the authentic hadith is that it is not anomalous. It is not irregular. You know what that means now. Inshallah, so clear for you. أو بمعنى الواو العاطفة لأنه منفي أيضا. So what did the author say? ولم يشذ. It was not anomalous. Oh, here. Oh, or يعل, or defective. Was not anomalous nor defective. And when we say it was not defective, this means, so it says بالبناء للمجهول. Just spin out, put that in parentheses. When we say it was not defective, this means was not, let's say, plagued by, subhanallah. That's actually a good translation. Not far. Illah, linguistic meaning of illah, sickness. So was not plagued, this hadith was not plagued by an obscure effective defect. An obscure but effective defect. Yani, imagine a poison that's very potent. You only need a small drop to make you sick. One little small drop of this poison, and it doesn't have any flavor and it doesn't have any smell, but it'll make you sick. So, yani, we are saying it's a condition for an authentic hadith to not have what? A defect that is khafiyah, hidden, obscure, not obvious, but qadiha, but effective. Yani, discrediting. A discrediting defect, an obscure, discrediting defect. That's the meaning of yu'al, yani, oh yu'al, nor was it defective. وقول الشارح الإمام الزرقاني في شرحه عند قول الناظم لم يعل. So now this explainer, Sheikh Al-Jabarti, rahimahullah. I feel reverence for him when I say his name, rahimahullah. Sheikh Al-Jabarti, he now, in this explanation of his, he cites the other explainer, the one whose explanation is perhaps more famous than this one. Yani, most likely it is. Who's that other explainer? You have it in your notes. Az-Zurqani. Yani, that's the one that we took his explanation. So for myself, I could potentially give you 3 explanations of Al-Bayquniya. Az-Zurqani's explanation, and this one, and we have also Sheikh Samir's explanation. It's an old one, and needs care though. If you happen to get your hands on that old explanation of Sheikh Samir for Al-Bayquniya that he did back in, early 2000s, that probably was. Yeah, that one needs, Yani, don't read that one cold. You need to review that one, inshallah ta'ala. So, Sheikh Al-Jabarti in this explanation is right now going to cite Az-Zurqani from his explanation of Al-Bayquniya. So he says that Az-Zurqani said, when commenting on the author saying, Lam yu'al, the author really said, oh yu'al. Said when he said lam yu'al was not defective, he said وَسَوَاءٌ كَانَتِ الْعِلَّةُ خَفِيَّةً أَوْ ظَاهِرَةً. So Az-Zurqani says the defect that must be missing from an authentic hadith is a defect, whether it is hidden or obvious, whether it's an obscure defect or an obvious defect. Either way, this must be missing from an authentic hadith. So says Az-Zurqani, and he continues, وَتَقْيِيدُ صَاحِبِ النُّخْبَةِ بِالْخَفِيَّةِ لَمْ يُرِدْ إِخْرَاجَ الظَّاهِرَةِ. So he said, he answered a potential question, Az-Zurqani. Az-Zurqani, he's saying, you might ask, what about when Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani said in An-Nukhbah about the defective hadith, that he said an obscure defect. He said an authentic hadith must be devoid of an obscure defect. Because here in Al-Baykuniyya, what is the author saying? He's just saying defect here. Oh, yu'al. He didn't say obscure defect here in the text. He just said nor a defect. So he didn't qualify it. Is it an obscure defect? Is it an obvious defect? So as Zurqani said, this defect that's in the text, it refers to an obscure one or an obvious one. That's what Az-Zurqani said. Sheikh Al-Jabarti is saying, no, it just means the obscure one, not the obvious one. So Al-Jabarti is saying, nor can it be defective means, nor can it have an obscure defect. That's all. And then he cites Az-Zurqani. Az-Zurqani said, this means it can't have any defect, an obscure one or an obvious one. And then Az-Zurqani, he answered a potential question. Like, what if you were to say, why? You said it obvious or obscure? Then how come Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani said that an authentic hadith cannot have an obscure defect? He didn't say obvious, he just said obscure only. So as Zurqani offers his answer, he says, he only said that because if an obscure defect is going to affect the authenticity, then an obvious one is for sure going to affect the authenticity. So that's what Az-Zurqani said. What does Sheikh Al-Jabarti say? Fihi nadar. This is disputable. What Az-Zurqani said is disputable. Now let me tell you something. I learned this. I took this explanation of Az-Zurqani, and we learned this statement here that Sheikh Al-Jabarti is now criticizing. And when we learned it without the criticism. So that means we took a criticized statement without a comment. So take a lesson. There's always a lesson to be learned. So what lesson can you take from that? That you might one day get a saying that is criticized. It might get to you. It might reach you. Didn't we hear about scholars who have mistakes? Didn't we hear about scholars who took on sayings that are not strong? It could be that something makes its way to you, and then you would take it. Because I took it, and I said, khalas. When I taught it, I said just like this, what Az-Zurqani said. Now Sheikh Al-Jabarti is saying, fihi nazar, this is disputable. And he continues, أقول بل أراد صاحب النخبة بالتقييد بالخفية إخراج الظاهرة. Sheikh Al-Jabarti is saying, no, it's exactly the opposite. I say it's the opposite of what Az-Zurqani said. When the author of An-Nukhbah, that's Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and we studied An-Nukhbah, and we have it translated, but it's still a rough draft. With Allah bless my time, with great blessing, then inshallah I would get to that and finish the metan and the sharh. Make dua for me, please. So Sheikh Al-Jabarti said, When the author of An-Nukhbah said that an authentic hadith cannot have an obscure defect, he meant deliberately to exclude the obvious defect. He did not want to talk about the obvious defect. It's opposite of what Az-Zurqani said. Az-Zurqani said the reason why Ibn Hajar said that it can't have an obscure defect, because if an obscure defect will discredit the hadith, then for sure an obvious one will discredit the hadith. Sheikh Al-Jabarti saying, no, that's not what he meant. Qad call, as they say, sounds good on paper, but that's not actually what he meant. He did actually deliberately mean to exclude the obvious defect. لأن أرباب هذا الفن إنما يريدون بالعلة الخفية إنما يريدون بالعلة الخفية لا الظاهرة. Because when, and here, what did he say? I want to translate this literally for you, just so you can, if you need to be shocked, you can feel shocked and get it over with. So he says, because when the lords of this craft, إنما يريدون بالعلة الخفية, they only meant by, when they would say the word illah, when they would say the defect, they only meant the obscure defect. When they would say the word illah, defect, they meant exclusively the obscure one. La zahira. They did not mean to talk about the obvious defect. ولا يطلقون اسم العلة على ما كان معروف الانقطاع أو الإرسال مثلا. They didn't used to use the word defect for a report that was obviously having a severed chain. Obviously. When it would obviously have a severed chain, they didn't say this hadith is defective hadith. They would say, though that is a defect, they would say this hadith is a disconnected hadith. See the difference here? They didn't used to say this hadith is a defective hadith when it had an obvious interruption in the chain. They would say this hadith is a disconnected hadith. Munqati'. So, because the defect was obvious, then they would name the actual defect, is the point being made here. When the defect was obvious, they wouldn't call it defective. It is defective, but they wouldn't use the word defective. When the defect was obvious, then they would call it by the defect itself. They wouldn't call it defective. They would call it munqati', for example, interrupted chain hadith. Or irsal, or they would say it's mursal hadith, which means the tabi'i attributed it to the Prophet directly. They don't say this hadith is defective hadith. They say this hadith is mursal hadith. This hadith is munqati' hadith. This hadith is mu'dal hadith. They would name the actual defect, not just call it defective like that. So I hope this case is clear for you. So, yani, mashallah, this explanation of Sheikh Al-Jabarti is a very nice one. It's very clear and it's brief. So, therefore, back over to the text here on the right side, when the author said, "Oh, yu'al," nor is it defective. So he meant, Sheikh Al-Jabarti is telling us, no, what it really does mean in this poem is, it does not have an obscure defect. If you have a question, please ask me. قال ولا يطلقون اسم العلة على ما كان معروف الانقطاع أو الإرسال مثلا من أول الأمر. They would not, this is Al-Jabarti rahimahullah saying, these scholars, the lords of this craft, the arbab is the plural of Rabb, the lords of this craft, they would merely use the word illah, defect, for, yeah, they would not use the word illah, defect, for what has a known obvious interruption in the chain, or it is obviously the report of a companion attributing it to the Prophet directly from the beginning, that's known and clear. Min awwal al-amr, yani from the jump, as one might say. Then they don't call it defective. They will call it by the name of that obvious defect. وَإِنَّمَا يُطْلِقُونَ عَلَى مَا كَانَ خَفِيًّا وإنما يطلقون على ما كان خفيا. قال الحافظ ابن الصلاح في علوم الحديث. Yes. So Hafiz ibn Salah, Sheikh Imam ibn Salah, Sheikh of Mustalah himself, rahimahullah, he said, الحديث المعلل هو الذي طلع فيه على علة تقدح في صحته مع أن ظاهره السلامة منها. He said a defective hadith is a hadith in which a defect was discovered, a defect that discredits the hadith's authenticity, although what appears is that the hadith is clear of such a defect. So that means it's obscure. انتهى. وقال الشارح الزرقاني في شرحه عند قول الناظم معلل عندهم قد عرفا وأفاد العراقي أن حد المعلل حديث فيه أسباب خفية طرأت عليه فأثرت فيه. الزرقاني, the other explainer of Al-Bayquniyah, when he was explaining the author's statement here, معلل عندهم قد عرفا, he said, وأفاد العراقي أن حد المعلل. This statement of the author means معلل, defective, according to them. Such a hadith is known when they were talking about defective hadith. وأفاد العراقي أن حد المعلل حديث فيه أسباب خفية طرأت عليه فأثرت فيه. Al-Iraqi, he was saying that the definition of a defective hadith is a hadith that has obscure reasons that happened to the hadith and affected it. So still talking about the obscurity. قال الحافظ ابن حجر وأحسن منه أن يقال هو حديث ظاهره السلامة اطلع فيه بعد التفتيش على قادح. Hafiz ibn Hajar said a better definition for a defective hadith is a hadith that appears to be sound, but something discrediting, a discreditor was discovered after probing. A hadith that appears to be sound, but a discreditor was discovered after probing. So this means obscure defect. So it's clear for you now. I'm saying all these words and reading all these quotes. I do want to read as much of the explanation here as I can, but at the same time, I don't want to bog you down with too many words and too much information. Nor do I want to bore you. So it's clear. What Sheikh Al-Jabarti, rahimahullah, wants to teach us here, he wants to teach us that the meaning of defective that's mentioned in the poem, it's mentioned without a qualifier. He doesn't say it's obviously defective nor obscurely defective. He only says that an authentic hadith has a continuous chain, and it's not irregular, and it's not defective. As Zurqani is saying, what the author meant by yu'al not defective is whether it's obvious or obscure, whether the defect were obvious or obscure. That's what the author meant, because if an obscure defect would discredit the report, then an obvious one for sure would. So sounds good on paper. But Sheikh Al-Jabarti is saying to us, this is not the standard talk of the hadith scholars. The standard talk of the hadith scholars is that when they say hadith is defective, they do actually mean in particular obscurely defective and not obviously defective. Because, as I think is clear for you now, when it is obviously defective, then they're going to call the hadith by the name of that defect. They're no longer going to call it merely, quote unquote, defective. Now they're going to call it munqati', severed, or mursal, yani reported from a tabi'i, from the Prophet directly, etc. So he says, Intaha, that's the end of the quote of Ibn Hajar. Ibn Hajar said, better than that definition is to say that a defective hadith is a hadith that ظاهره السلامة. It appears to be sound. اطلع فيه بعد التفتيش على قادح. But after probing, a discreditor was discovered. Intaha, end quote. That's the end of the quote of Ibn Hajar. Al-Shaykh Al-Jabarti, rahimahullah, he says, Aqul, I say, yani, I have a commentary here. ذهب أهل هذا الفن على هذا سابقا ولاحقا. The people of this field have explained defective hadith in this way, past and present. وذكروه في مؤلفاتهم. And they mentioned it in their authoring's. وعرفوا العلة بما ذكر. And they define the illah, the defect, as mentioned. Yani, he's saying it the way I'm telling you. قال بعضهم لكن قد أطلق بعضهم اسم العلة على الأسباب الظاهرة. But some said, and this is important here, some said it is possible that some of the scholars would use the name illah, defect, for something with obvious problems. وَلَمْ يُرِيدُوا بِذَلِكَ الْعِلَّةَ الْمُصْطَلَحَ عَلَيْهَا. He's telling us, but then when they do that, when they use the word illah, defect, for a report with an obvious defect, then, yani, they do it sometimes, but then they don't mean to use it in the technical sense. Then they don't mean to use it in the technical sense. They're just pretty much using it in the literal sense. It's defective hadith. That's very important, because there's other things like that too. Now you have something to compare to. Compare what to? Like, for example, don't you know there's a type of hadith called mashhur? You know there's a type of hadith called mashhur. That's the one that has at least 3 reporters at every level. If we're saying mashhur means the one that has at least 3 reporters at every level, then that means we are saying the technical definition of mashhur. But you do already know too, brothers and sisters, that sometimes they would say this hadith is mashhur. It's a famous hadith. They don't mean the technical definition. They just mean literally it is famous. It's a popular hadith, widespread, but could be fabricated or could be weak. or has no source. And like that, some of the sheikhs, they said, I heard with my own ear. So if you want, you can ask further details if you get the opportunity. The sheikh, he says about Hadith al-Jariyah that it is muttarib. Muttarib. Muttarib, that's a type of hadith. Hadith al-muttarib. Clashing. Meaning all of its versions go against, each version goes against the other in such a way that not one of those versions can be given priority. And so the whole hadith with all of its renditions is weak. That's muttarib. The sheikh said in some of his offerings that the hadith of the slave girl is muttarib. And I heard from the sheikhs different explanations of this ittirab. Some of them said, nah, he just meant here linguistic meaning of muttarib. This hadith of the slave girls clashing, its different versions are clashing, but he doesn't mean the technical meaning of muttarib, because technically muttarib would mean that all of the versions clash in such a way that we cannot use any of them, and therefore the entire hadith with all of its versions is weak. But Sheikh, is he saying that about Hadith al-Jariyah? That all of its versions are weak, or is saying some of them are weak and others are authentic? Because if he's saying others, some are weak and others are authentic, means he's not using the technical definition of muttarib. So I heard that from some of the mashayikh in explaining the sheikh's statement about the hadith of the slave girl. And also I heard some of the mashayikh say that what the sheikh meant by saying that it's muttarib is that it's muttarib according to some scholars. So according to some scholars, the hadith of the slave girl is technically muttarib, clashing in such a way that all of its renditions are canceling each other out, and the whole hadith is dropped with all of its versions. That's what I heard from some of them. So if you want, you get the opportunity to ask Sheikh Samir or Sheikh Nabil or one of the strong mashayikh about this, and someone who give direct answer, not indirect answer. I don't advise you to ask someone's going to give you indirect answer, or if he did give you indirect answer, ask someone else. He said, لأنها إنما تكون بالأسباب الخفية التي تظهر من سبر طرق الحديث. The defective hadith, according to the terminology of the scholars, the terminology of the hadith scholars is that the illah defect refers to obscure problems in the hadith that only appear when you compare the versions. The problems that are in the hadith only appear when you compare the different versions and renditions of the hadith. Then you're going to see where the mistakes are or the defects are. Wallahu a'lam. We'll stop there.